Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining the webinar this morning. We are going to get started here in just a minute. We'll just give everyone a few minutes just in case anyone's having issues with getting connected to GoToWebinar, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right, well, good morning again, everyone, and thank you all for joining the Rethinking Graduate Services in the Wake of Graduate Outcomes webinar here with Handshake. My name is David Shull. I'll be your host for this morning. My role here at Handshake, I kind of serve as the head of Handshake UK, and we'll be taking you through the webinar today. Before we get started, though, just wanted to do a few housekeeping items. Our hope is that this is a fairly interactive webinar as well. So hopefully you'll see on your GoToWebinar panel a section to ask questions. So as we go through the presentation today, feel free to type in questions there. We'll be monitoring them as we go through the webinar, and as appropriate, we'll answer them as we go. But we'll also leave some time at the end to discuss either larger questions or more philosophical things as well. So feel free to add those. Also worth noting that we are recording this session. So if you want to come back and reference things later, we will distribute that with everyone who's in attendance this morning, as well as make it available to anybody else that you may think would be kind of interested in learning more about this. So again, just a little bit of the housekeeping reminder of the agenda that was circulated ahead of time. We're going to start off with just a super quick overview of what Handshake is. We think this will be helpful context since we are aware that for many of you, you may not be familiar with Handshake or kind of what brings us here to the UK. We'll try and keep that part pretty brief because we really do want to focus on this concept of collecting graduate outcomes data and leveraging it to proactively engage with graduates, which is where we'll spend the bulk of the time today. Like I said, we'll be focusing on a couple different stages of that process. We'll be talking about some of the thoughts that we've had around helping universities collect this outcome data, and then how universities and career centers can leverage that data to proactively engage students that may still need support after graduation, as well as leveraging that data to tell the story of the impact that your teams are having across campus. So with all of that, we'll try and leave plenty of time for questions, and we'll go ahead and get started here. So to start with, again, just a little bit of context setting on kind of what Handshake is. And it will make sense in just a moment why there's a picture of me standing on an iceberg here, I promise. But Handshake got started, as will become as probably no surprise for all of you who kind of picked up my accent, got started in the United States a little over 5 years ago when we were actually students at a university called Michigan Tech. Many of you probably have never heard of Michigan Tech. In fact, I'd be surprised if any of you had. It doesn't exactly have a global brand, and it is incredibly remote. In fact, it's north of about 80% of the Canadian population, which is why there's this picture of me standing on an iceberg, just a few just right next to campus, really, to give you a sense of kind of how remote Michigan Tech actually is. But it's a great engineering school. It's where we went to university, and we were studying things like computer engineering, computer science, and we had a few experiences that really fundamentally shaped our journey. And the first was actually pretty early on in our academic career. We had the opportunity to engage with our career office on campus. And they helped us take the experiences that we had leading up to university and put them into a CV and cover letter that resonated with employers and ended up getting us opportunities that we never would have gotten on our own. And so we knew firsthand the impact that this office was having on campus. But when we started to talk to other students on campus, we realized that fundamentally the kind of perception of the office was an office that sends a lot of email And when we talked with the employer relations team and we asked them, how can we get out to some of these kind of non-traditional companies, if you will, for a school in the Midwest, like some of the technology companies out in Silicon Valley, they shared that it was actually a pretty big challenge for them to help us with that. While they could help with the mechanics of the resumes and CVs and the cover letters, most of those companies weren't recruiting on campus. They weren't posting vacancies in the system. They weren't hiring a lot of graduates, and it was kind of a non-traditional approach. And so it was through these challenges that we realized there was a major opportunity in the US at the time to be able to create software to genuinely empower universities and to partner with them to better engage students, to build stronger employer relationships, and to rethink the way that these connections happen. And so in 2014, we got started. We told ourselves if we could partner with 3 universities in the first 3 years, that we'd keep going, that we'd still kind of pursue this mission that we have as a company to democratize opportunity. Never having imagined that just over 4 years later, Handshake now supports over 900 universities in the United States. We've grown faster in kind of higher education technology than any company in history, supporting just over 85% of the top 500 universities in the US and have about 14 million students. So while we are brand new to the UK and we are still very much kind of standing up partnerships here, we're not new to this career services space. And so a lot of the lens that we'll take from the kind of perspective collecting these outcomes is rooted in some of the challenges in the US. But we've been really excited to learn about how the same solutions that we've built out there can actually help with some of the challenges facing universities when it comes to graduate outcomes. Handshake was built as a network. So one of the things that you'll see as we go through the kind of product is that we're able to leverage this database of 420,000 companies who use Handshake to manage their entire early career ecosystem. Companies manage their entire early career pipeline through the Handshake system. Today we have 420,000 companies, 100% of the Fortune 500 in the US. And what I think is kind of a neat stat is that we already have about 80% of the FTSE 100 actively recruiting on Handshake, even though we haven't partnered with any universities officially here in the UK. So this is really a global network. Companies are able to manage their vacancies, sourcing, events, all of that from a single network for free. So they're able to connect and manage all of that at scale. So that hopefully is a little bit of helpful context. Like I said, we are brand new to the UK. We're actually not launching until next summer, so summer of 2020, and starting conversations with universities today who are interested in being kind of potentially early partners. So that is it for the kind of Handshake background and context. What we're going to jump in today is a feature that we've kind of built out called First Destination Surveying. Throughout the webinar, we'll be using the Handshake platform as an example. That's obviously what we know the most and the best. But the hope is that the principles that we highlight here are things that will actually be interesting and worthwhile, regardless of the technology that you're using. So if you're thinking about collecting data or surveys from students and being able to kind of preempt the graduate outcomes with your own data collection, that you can start to leverage some of these principles. Now, I mentioned that this feature actually came out of some work that we were doing in the US, and I think the UK is actually, in my learnings over the past 7 months, quite a bit ahead of the rest of the world in many ways when it comes to actually quantifying the return on investment from the university perspective. In the US, there's no such centralization, there's no such standard for how kind of graduate outcomes is measured. So each university has to decide if they want to do it, if they are going to do it, how that happens, and it created a pretty haphazard ecosystem with a lot of challenges to get students to build that. And so we started talking with universities, and what we realized was that even though this data was incredibly challenging to collect at times, it was also probably some of the most important data that a career service and a university could get their hands on. From being able to demonstrate the impact that an office was having to being able to preemptively engage and help students, these data sets were incredibly important. And so we said, could we actually start to apply some of the research and data science that we've done to helping universities more effectively collect this data? But the first thing we had to do is understand what were actually the bottlenecks. And so in talking with universities, both here in the UK, back in the US, we hear the same types of themes from kind of, I think, surveys in general. The first being that students don't particularly like surveys. I've talked to a lot of students, talked to a lot of universities, and the kind of feedback is that it can be really hard to get students to actually complete these, unless there's kind of what I like to say is like a very strong carrot or a big incentive or a strong stick forcing them to kind of complete these surveys. It can be hard for them to actually do that. And when we talk to students and we really get down to the kind of core of why that is, what we find is that for students, it feels like they are giving a lot without actually getting any value in return. So it's hard for them to kind of abstract out they're taking this survey with the overall value and benefit to the university and the brand as a whole. And so that was the first principle. Like, how do we actually get students to think about this? The second was that there's this kind of data integrity challenge that can come through kind of traditional survey methods. So if you are asking students what company they work for or what location they're in, you may get all kinds of different abbreviations for the company name. You may get different spellings of cities. You may get a suburb when really what you're looking for is the actual kind of nearest major metropolitan area. And so it can be really challenging for the data team and for folks that are actually administering these surveys to then comb through all of that information and actually put that into a cohesive ecosystem or kind of a cohesive report. And the final challenge was that once you've done all of that work, collecting this data, getting students to fill it out, and then actually kind of cleaning it up, it's not generally integrated with the rest of the workflows that are happening across the university and across the kind of employability offering. And so there's a lot of missed opportunity to be able to effectively engage employers with this context, to be able to proactively engage students, to invite them to various events and things like that. So this was kind of the backdrop that we've approached this challenge of engaging graduates, providing proactive support. And it really all starts with this kind of data collection challenge. And so the principles that we really started to recognize as being important here really can be simplified into two themes. The first is this concept of gamification. Basically, the way that we thought about this is how could we create a survey experience where students feel like they get value for every piece of value or data that they share with the university. And so this principle of actually creating incentives, you can do that in a lot of different ways, and we've experimented with many of them. You'll see built into the product, students get real-time feedback on how they're comparing to their peers, things like gift cards and kind of monetary incentives, but making it so that there's actually this kind of value exchange that students are feeling at a pretty instantaneous level. Now, the last component is really thinking about integration. And this kind of integration kind of, I think, solves both the day-to-day workflow challenges of how can we integrate this with the rest of our workflows, as well as some of the data integrity issues around how do we actually help students discover relevant content, how do we create clean data across this process. So that's a little bit of the backdrop here. What I'd love to actually do now is move into the handshake system and just put a little bit of a visual to what this actually looks like. As we kind of go through this, a few housekeeping items. Again, I have to apologize in advance. While we have our engineering team actively working on updating the handshake system for the UK, you'll still see some Americanisms, I'll say, as we go through this. It's really important for us that we are listening and learning to your teams. One of the big principles that we've had as we've kind of moved over here to the UK is that we really don't believe that just because it worked in the US, it will work here. Actually, this feature is a great example. When we first came over here, I didn't think that anybody would be interested in this outcome survey tool because I thought that you all had it figured out. So, but we're really listening and learning to figuring that out. So I apologize in advance for the Americanisms that you will see in the demo site. But to put a little bit of a visualization to that kind of concept of gamification, the concept of centralizing this, I've just moved into the Handshake product here. So this is the student view in Handshake. So when they log in, Handshake, again, full featured career management system, but right now we're really focusing on this outcome tool. So as a student, when I log into my dashboard, I can actually see that right here I've been invited to take what we're calling this first destination survey. Now, there's a couple different entry points. Students can actually be invited directly to take this survey. We also have intelligent drip campaigns that use basically data science and machine learning to understand the best times to send emails to your students, inviting them to actually complete the survey. And then the third entry point is we actually have a kiosk that allows you, if you have a mandatory graduation collection or maybe like a cap and gown or something along those lines where a student is physically at a place, you can actually set up a kiosk, they can swipe their ID card and right from there actually start this process. So if we go ahead and as a student, we'll go ahead and click on take this survey. This now brings me up to this first page in the system where I'm starting to get this personalized experience. I can confirm some of these different details. And we ask the student for a what would be a non-education email. So it would be a non.ac.uk email. This is going to be a really helpful tool for you being able to stay in touch with that student after graduation. This is also automatically added to their Handshake account so that you can continue to access, that your students can continue to access the system after graduation, so they can continue to engage with those types of resources. Now, as a student, I click on begin here, and it now starts to take me through this kind of survey experience where we're trying to understand where the student is at in their kind of graduation outcome process. Generally, this is triggered anywhere between a few months before graduation or a few months after the student graduates. And these questions can also, you can add custom questions here to personalize this experience and collect the data that you're looking for. So let's just pretend like this particular student has gotten a kind of full-time position after graduation. So we can see the various options here. We can say that they are going on to work. And right away, as I answered that question as a student, I've now seen in real time how I compare to my peers at my university who have also completed the survey. And when we think about that gamification, what we found is that students are almost desperately curious to know how they compare to their peers. And so by showing them that for every data set that they give, it allows them to feel like they're actually getting value. So we've seen this feature alone drive a lot of that engagement up. So as you're thinking about building your own surveys or you're thinking about building out some of these tools, thinking about ways you can incorporate this type of gamification, we've seen result in pretty powerful results. Now, of course, this is only shown if there's enough data to sufficiently aggregate this to protect privacy. And so there are settings, and we're going to be very conscious of that as well. But as a student, if I continue to go through this, I can start to share some more of this data. And again, for every question that I answer, I'm seeing in real time how I compare to my peers who have also completed this survey. Now, this is where I think it gets pretty exciting from the Handshake perspective. So we talked a little bit at the beginning about how this integration of services can be, or maybe lack thereof, can be challenging from the perspective of a administrator trying to manage a employability office. But it's also pretty frustrating from a student perspective, right? From the student perspective, what we hear is that you as an office, like I'm using your system to apply for these various things, like you should kind of know a little bit about me already. And so as a student in Handshake, as they're going through this survey, we actually know what positions that student has already applied to in your system. And so if they got one of these positions that was available to them in the platform, they can actually just say, yes, this is the position that I got, select that, and it will automatically fill that for them. And you can see that we're tying this to an employer profile. Going back to that third principle, though, of data cleanliness, we're also not only matching this to employer profiles across our database of 420,000 companies, but we're also allowing students to type in locations and automatically geocoding them. So what we'll see is that when it comes to reporting, there's none of this kind of issues with different spelling or things like that. We're automatically creating the lat-long geography of where they are. We're tying this to an employer. One of the things that's probably worth noting here is that, particularly if you have a lot of students that are working for SMEs, small businesses that may not be in that kind of cohort of 420,000 companies, they can type their own here. And even if they do that, we have type ahead technology that will allow them to actually map to any other organizations within the system. It's visual, it's really been kind of aligned to make the student experience really seamless. Of course, this works well on mobile also. So kind of continuing through the process here, we can start to see, again, even on things like the title, we're using type ahead to help the student keep that data clean and kind of go through that process. And the last page here, salary, obviously the default here would be changed to pounds, but the student can define their base salary here. And again, thinking about that data cleanliness, we've built in mechanisms to automatically detect whether or not a student has entered data incorrectly. So if I enter in maybe 26,000 pounds, it's a great starting salary. But as a student, if I tick hourly wage here, the system will now actually start to suggest that actually maybe that was like an issue. So I can start to suggest, and it'll actually kind of proactively suggest maybe I meant to select annual salary here as I start to submit that. So I can go ahead and fill this out. And once I've kind of completed all of this, I can really start to, I can kind of submit this and we'll see, there we go. And we start at the end of September. Whoops, there we go. So once we've filled this out, we can go ahead and complete that survey. Of course, you can add any other questions that you'd like here. The final thing that we offer for students is that we automatically add this to their profile. Students can, of course, control whether or not they'd like to do that, but it updates their profile. So not only will you be able to report on that through the first destination tool set, which we'll look at in just a minute, but as a student, I can now actually automatically have that on my professional profile. In Handshake, students can choose to make this profile visible to employers. And so it's now automatically added that here. It's up to the student if they want to make that public or not. It also helps other students connect with that student and ask them questions around what's it like to work at that organization if the student chooses to make that available. So there's enables some of that kind of peer-to-peer learning as well. So that is the kind of what I'll call top of funnel, the data collection piece. Again, the key principles that we think about there is integrating this with the rest of the student experience. So as a student applies to different things within the system, being able to suggest that content for them intelligently, as well as focusing on the data cleanliness and the integrity of that data. We'll see that pay dividends on the reporting side of things. And finally, the gamification so that students actually want to take this survey and it doesn't feel like a hassle. So all of these things kind of come together to make it easier to collect that data set from students. Now I'm going to go ahead and switch to my administrative view here. So this is the view that you as an administrator would have access to within the Handshake platform. Over on the left-hand side, you can see all the different things that Handshake offers. We'll look at a few of these just in the context of a few of the workflows that we think about in engaging graduates and sending out this type of personalized content. But where most of our time will be spent is actually under this first destination tab. So if we go ahead and click on first destination here, this allows us to see all the different surveys that we've created within the system. Everything you just saw is actually pretty much out of the box. So we'll obviously be tweaking it for the UK, but there doesn't require a lot of setup or intensive work. Literally, it takes about 5 to 10 minutes to set up a full survey with personalized drip campaigns and the kind of timeline that you're looking for with custom questions. But we'll go ahead and click in on this survey here as an administrator. This lets us now actually start to see the status of those different drip campaigns that we may have set up. Again, you can customize those, and Handshake suggests some dates and times that may be effective as far as getting students to actually complete that survey. We can now also see a quick overview of how our students are responding. So we can see that we have this kind of, that we have about 12% of our students that are still looking for something. About 81% of them are working. So it's pretty good statistics here for this kind of fake student population that we've generated. I'll also just draw your attention briefly to this response rate and knowledge rate. These are terms that we've created to help you distinguish between students who have actually completed the survey themselves versus students that actually maybe told a faculty member, maybe shared with you on your reports, maybe they went through the registrar, whatever it may be. That data can then be imported into Handshake. We tag that as a knowledge rate response just so you can distinguish the source of that. You can also tag the source of that as well. So if you found out that a student was working at a company on LinkedIn, you can tag that and actually start to report on the different sources of your data intelligently. So let's now kind of switch gears a little bit from the data collection to actually thinking about how can we use this data to more proactively engage with students. And so as the example that I think may be interesting to talk through is, let's say we want to target that 12.6% of our population that we know is still seeking. They've shared with us that we're still looking for opportunities, and we want to communicate a few things to them. One, we want to communicate that as a service, we're still available to support them in this process. But we also want to share maybe an event that's coming up that we've really actually kind of organized specifically for graduates who are looking for some additional assistance. We also want to let them know about our kind of autumn fair that's coming up here and invite them to attend that if they so choose. So we can actually start to do that integrated in the system as well. If we scroll down here, we have the ability to start to look at these different statuses, and we can actually start to look at outcome, toggle down to our students that are still seeking, and now we'll have kind of this list of all of those students. Now, if we go ahead and we just select this, we can select all of those students, and we could actually start to email them right from here and start to communicate them that way. We could also export a list of those students into an Excel file that we could use kind of for other purposes. But what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to suggest adding a label here. So if we add a label, this is a way that we can tag on the student profile a piece of data or kind of a tag that's only visible to us within the career services space, the kind of administrative view. And that allows us to then track this across the entire ecosystem. So I'm going to say, 2019, maybe it's Q3, still seeking, whatever you want to create here. We'll then apply that label to that cohort of students. So now every one of those students has this kind of tag, and we can now use this anywhere from inviting them to a fair to inviting them to an event, whatever it may be. But let's say that we actually just want to launch into, and we actually want to start with communicating with them. And so we can go over and now start to toggle over to this email tool over on the left-hand side. Let's go ahead and create a new email here. So this is the built-in kind of email communication tool that we have in Handshake available to universities. We can click on create an email. And now we have a couple different options here. So we can go ahead and create something from scratch from one of the templates that we have, or maybe we already have an email that we want to borrow. So in this case, I've created an example email for this using this tool. We'll say it's the still seeking event invites. We can go ahead and select that, add a name here. So we'll say webinar still seeking example. Obviously, you can name this whatever you'd like. And if we go ahead and click on next, you can see that it brings in all the kind of detail here. Of course, you can build custom emails here, everything from kind of the imagery to the different opportunities. But we've now also been able to integrate different content across the system. So we can bring in career fairs, we can do events, we could even tailor out different vacancies and things that are in the system that may be relevant for a particular population of students. Once we've done that, we can then go ahead and click over on next. We can now select the student population that we'd like to bring in, and we can actually use that label that we applied. So here's that label from the survey. We can now go ahead and select that. Here's our students that we know are still seeking. We can go ahead and send this invitation with maybe the subject line of still looking for the right opportunity. These resources may help. Whatever you'd like this to be. You can kind of personalize that. We can change the name, who it's coming from, as well as who we're including on that. These are defaults. Obviously, it would not say Handshake here. You can set these in your settings on how you want to manage that. We could schedule that to be sent now or later. And now, once we've sent that, we can go ahead, send it out to students, and actually start to track the engagement with that as well. So click rates, open rates, all of that is being tracked. We can also track if any of those students activated and kind of engaged with the center for the first time based on that information. Now, once we kind of engage those students, now we can switch gears over to like, how do we actually tell the story of the impact that we're having here? How do we leverage some of this data? And for that, we can go ahead and go back to this first destination tab. I'll show two different things here. If we go ahead and click on the university overview, you'll notice that there's this report tab. This report tab allows you to now automatically see a visualization of how your students are being, or where your students are going after graduation based on that survey data. So we can actually start to see for a custom dashboard for each vertical. We could export this with one click to an Excel file. That's going to be something you could then share out with the rest of campus, share out with government organizations. And if we scroll down, we can start to see heat map of where students are going, how that breaks down by category, breakdown by kind of degree levels as well. Kind of all this information is now summarized for us in this really easy to do kind of access chart. And again, all of this can be exported with just one click. But the really neat thing, I think, going back to that third principle that we talked about at the overview, is that by having a single integrated system that integrates the outcome and graduation collection with other services that are being made available to the university, we can actually start to tell a more comprehensive picture using our analytics tool. So built into Handshake is this analytics tool. This allows us to actually start to see and access different types of reports. But we can actually start to create custom data sets that tie together kind of our first destination data with other things that are moving through the system. So this is a tool that makes it really easy for you to start to access and kind of tell the story behind the impact that you're having across the different levels here. Now, if we go ahead and we look on the left-hand side, this is where you can see all the different details here. We could actually start to scroll down, and maybe we want to know what the different statuses are for students. We want to know the response type. We want to know how many students actually failed that response type. We can add that with a count. but we can also start to pivot and do more sophisticated reports within the Handshake system as well. So maybe we actually want to know, how does that break down by sector? How many students do we have going to different sectors? We can just go ahead and pivot right here, click on run, and Handshake will now let us know how many students do we have in these kind of different response types broken down by the different sectors that are available to them. And right from here, we can also actually create a visualization that may be kind of help tell more of that story. So we can actually start to see what this data looks like and share this out with other people within the system. Now, because Handshake is integrated, it can manage everything from fairs to events to appointments. You can actually start to build more sophisticated reports that merge together these different elements and actually allow you to start to even create what's called an engagement score to understand the correlation between the level of engagement with your office and the outcomes that students are getting, which you can imagine can be incredibly powerful for talking about kind of the overall value of the service, as well as kind of the impact to students that they can see and expect when they come to your office. So those are kind of the highlights, if you will. So different kind of maybe summarizing what we've talked about, and then we can open it up to any questions. If folks have that, again, feel free to answer or add any questions that people may have in the system. But just to summarize what we've talked about so far, when we think about different elements and ways to engage and kind of help connect with alumni and with graduates, the first step is engaging with students and collecting that data so we know what the starting point is. We think that by creating a gamified experience that integrates the system with other things that the students are already looking at, it can be an incredibly powerful way to tell that story. And then once you've done that, actually leveraging that data, whether it's through personalized invitations to events that you may be hosting, personalized invitations to advising appointments, starting to incorporate maybe different resources that you have for those alumni, being able to have a system that lets you kind of tell the story behind everything that you're offering for those graduates is really, really key. But again, the prerequisite to that is knowing which graduates need that help. And then finally, once you've actually kind of completed that journey, being able to tell the story with data and being able to kind of pull that all together really is going to be a pretty influential piece of the puzzle as well. So that wraps up our overview. We have a few more minutes though. If folks have any questions, we can give it a few more minutes. Feel free to type them into the comment box. We're wrapping up here a little bit earlier than we expected. If you do want to learn more about Handshake, obviously we would be more than happy to set up some time to do a little bit of a deeper dive into other features. This was only one vertical that we talked about, but we would love to have the opportunity to get your feedback on the system and to share a little bit more in depth on kind of our plans here for the UK. So like I said, we can open up for any questions. Doesn't look like any have come through so far. So if anybody has any, we'll give everyone a couple minutes to maybe type out a couple questions here if you have any. But otherwise, we can give folks a few more minutes back in their day. All right. Well, doesn't look like there are any questions coming through, so I appreciate all of you who joined today. If you have any questions that do occur to you after the fact, feel free to send them my way. Email is just david@joinhandshake.com. Really appreciate everyone's time. Like I said, we'll be sending out the recording if that's of interest. But otherwise, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and we will talk to you soon.